Caleb Morgan, a weathered Montana farmer, risks everything to save a barefoot boy, Benji, from a brutal blizzard. Facing foreclosure and a town's judgment, Caleb's act of compassion backfires as rumors spread and the bank moves to seize his land. When Benji vanishes from a children's center, suspicion deepens and Caleb is questioned. A cryptic note hints at Benji's mysterious past, leaving Caleb and his son Noah teetering on the edge of loss. As hope fades, 6 military jeeps arrive, signaling a truth that could change everything. Will Caleb's kindness be his salvation or his undoing? If Caleb's story of courage and compassion moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories celebrating real heroes. Leave a comment. Have you witnessed quiet acts of kindness? Your voice matters. Help us honor everyday heroes and keep their stories alive. Caleb Morgan stood against the biting wind, his breath forming clouds in the frigid Montana air. The blizzard roared around him, a merciless beast that tore at his worn coat and stung his bare hands. He'd lived on this rugged patch of northern Montana his entire life, 45 years of toil etched into the lines of his weathered face. This land was more than dirt and frost. It was the legacy of 3 generations, a stubborn testament to survival. His grandfather had broken the soil, his father had nurtured it, and Caleb had poured his soul into it, rising before dawn to coax life from fields that fought back with ice and stone. But this winter was a thief, crueler than any before. It arrived early, its first frost a silent assassin that choked half the wheat crop before it could take root. The old combine, a relic of better days, coughed its last breath and repairs drained what little money remained. By Christmas, the savings were gone. By New Year's, the bank's 3rd foreclosure notice sat like a vulture on the kitchen table, its words clawing at Caleb's resolve. At 45, he felt older than his years. The cold seeped deeper now, not just into his bones, but into his heart. Grief had carved its own path through him since Evelyn's death 3 winters ago. Pneumonia had stolen her swiftly, leaving the farmhouse too quiet, its walls echoing with memories of her laughter. Now it was just Caleb and Noah, his 10-year-old son, who tried so hard to be brave. Caleb saw it in the boy's eyes, the way he squared his shoulders, mimicking his father's stoic resolve. But at night, when Noah thought no one could hear, Caleb caught the muffled sobs into his pillow, each one a dagger to his chest. He wanted to hold his son, to promise that everything would be all right. But the weight of their crumbling world made such promises feel like lies. The days stretched long, filled with endless tasks, mending fences with fingers numb from cold, feeding the few hens that still scratched in the yard, stoking the old wood stove that coughed more smoke than heat. At night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table under the dim glow of a single lamp, circling bills, scratching out numbers that never added up. He whispered vows to himself, to the land, to Evelyn's memory, to Noah, that he'd hold on for one more season, one more crop. But the soil was as tired as he was, and hope was a fragile thing, slipping through his calloused hands like sand. They had little left, a few sacks of feed, a handful of chickens, and a home teetering on the edge of loss. Yet every morning, Caleb packed Noah's lunch, walked him to the school bus, and waved with a smile that hid his dread. The bank had circled a date on the calendar, a guillotine poised to sever the only life they had left. Losing the farm wasn't just about land, it was losing the last tether to who they were. The storm hit without warning, a savage force that buried the fields in minutes. Snow fell thick and relentless, the wind howling like a pack of wolves across the open plains. Caleb was near the north fence, wrestling with a broken post, when he caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. At first, he thought it was a deer, maybe a coyote, but as he squinted through the swirling snow, his heart lurched. It was a child, small, alone, stumbling barefoot through the drifts. No shoes, no proper coat, just a threadbare hoodie flapping against the gale. Caleb didn't pause to think, didn't weigh the risks or call for help. His boots sank deep into the frozen earth as he sprinted, the wind clawing at his face. The child staggered, nearly swallowed by a snowdrift, and Caleb's pulse pounded with a primal urgency. When he reached the boy, he saw a face no older than 7, cheeks raw from windburn, eyes wide with a hollow kind of terror that had gone beyond tears. The boy was silent, frozen in a place where fear had numbed everything else. Caleb's heart broke at the sight. He tore off his own coat, the only shield he had against the storm, and wrapped it around the boy's trembling frame. The child weighed nothing in his arms, as fragile as a bird, and Caleb cradled him close, trudging back to the farmhouse as the blizzard lashed harder. His mind raced with questions. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? Why was he alone? But they didn't matter, not now. There was something ancient in Caleb, an instinct passed down through generations of farmers who'd faced Montana's brutal winters. It wasn't in books or manuals. It was a quiet voice that whispered, "Do what's right." He didn't stop to wonder if the boy was a runaway, a danger, or someone else's problem. He saw a life in peril and acted just as his ancestors had when neighbors were buried under snow or barns burned down. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb laid the boy by the fire, piling quilts over his shivering body. The boy's feet were swollen, angry red from the cold, and his silence was unnerving. Caleb stayed awake through the night, watching the rise and fall of the child's chest, willing each breath to come. His own exhaustion gnawed at him, but he couldn't rest, not when a life hung in the balance. Noah, wide-eyed and quiet, sat nearby, his young mind grappling with the stranger in their home. Caleb saw the worry in his son's face, the same fear he. In the bitter cold of a winter night, Caleb Morgan trudged through the snow, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, his breath visible in the frigid air. The world was silent, save for the howl of the wind, when he found the boy, small, shivering, curled up in a ditch like a discarded rag doll. Caleb's heart clenched at the sight, a pang of protectiveness surging through him. He didn't hesitate. He scooped the child into his arms, the boy's frail body trembling against his chest, and carried him back to the warmth of his modest farmhouse. Caleb wasn't the kind of man to make a show of his deeds, nor was he flawless, but he was the sort who couldn't walk past suffering without acting. His conscience wouldn't allow it. He thought of his own son, Noah, tucked safely in bed, and imagined the terror of a child left to freeze in the snow. It wasn't a question of what the world expected. It was about what was right. Inside the house, Caleb's hands moved with quiet urgency. He stoked the fire until it roared, casting a golden glow across the room, and ladled steaming soup into a chipped ceramic mug. He sat the boy beside Noah's bed, piling every blanket he could find over the child's bony shoulders. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide and wary, darting around the unfamiliar space. Caleb didn't ask for his name. Somehow it didn't feel necessary. All that mattered was that the boy was safe, at least for tonight. As he watched the child sip the soup, Caleb felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. In a world that often turned a blind eye, a single act of kindness could define a man, especially when no one was there to witness it. By morning, the snowstorm had relented, but a different kind of storm was brewing in Caleb's life. He rose before dawn, the weight of the previous night heavy on his mind. He brewed a pot of strong coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen, and dialed the sheriff's office. His voice was steady as he explained where he'd found the boy, how he'd been half frozen, how warmth and shelter had been more urgent than protocol. The boy, still silent, clung to a worn stuffed bear Noah had pressed into his hands the night before. His small fingers gripped the toy tightly, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and suspicion, as if he'd learned too young that trust was a dangerous thing. 2 hours later, Deputy Malden arrived, his badge catching the morning light, his clipboard clutched like a shield. His expression was hard, his gaze sharp with judgment. "You found him yesterday evening?" he asked, his pen scratching against the paper. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "That's right. Roads were iced over. It was dark. He was freezing." Malden's response was curt, his tone clipped. "Protocols, Morgan. Protocols." Each flash of the deputy's camera made the boy flinch, his small body tensing as if the light itself was a threat. The radio in Malden's cruiser crackled with static, delivering fragments of reports. No missing children matching the boy's description, no frantic parents calling, no leads at all, just an eerie silence that seemed to deepen the deputy's scrutiny. The town of Milford wasted no time in weaving its own narrative. Whispers slithered through the feed store, where folks muttered that Caleb Morgan had always been odd since his wife passed. At the diner, hushed voices speculated about what a man living alone with his son might be hiding. The hardware store suddenly couldn't find the parts Caleb needed, and the school principal, with a smile too polite to be genuine, suggested Noah, stay home for a few days, just until things are sorted out. It didn't matter that Caleb had saved a child's life. In the eyes of a town gripped by fear and suspicion, he'd committed the sin of acting on his own, of prioritizing compassion over rules. He was no longer just Caleb, the quiet farmer struggling to keep his land. He was that farmer, the one who didn't call the sheriff right away, the one with unpaid loans, the one who kept to himself. The next blow came swiftly. A bank representative arrived, his voice cold and clinical. Given recent developments in your financial standing, we're expediting foreclosure. Caleb stood in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. Noah watched from the porch, his young face clouded with confusion, sensing the weight of a world turning against his father. I saved that boy, Caleb said, his voice low but firm. The representative's reply was devoid of empathy. That's for the authorities to determine. It felt like a trial without a jury, a condemnation for daring to show kindness in a town that had forgotten what it meant to care. When the county car came to take the boy away, Caleb's chest tightened. The child's face pressed against the window, his eyes wee and glistening with unshed tears. He still hadn't spoken, not to the deputy, not to the social worker, not even to Noah. His only responses were quiet nods and flinches, as if the world had taught him to fear every outstretched hand. Caleb stood in the driveway long after the car disappeared, the dust settling around him like the weight of the town's judgment. Not one neighbor stopped by. No one offered a word of gratitude or reassurance, only sideways glances through half-drawn curtains and the sharp sting of isolation. By the next morning, the local paper had spun the story into something sinister. Unidentified child found on isolated farm, authorities investigating. No charges were filed, but in a place like Milford, rumors spread faster than truth and clung tighter to the town's collective memory. Caleb's heart sank when he heard the boy, now called Benji Doe, had vanished again. The Horizon Children's Center, 2 counties away, reported he'd slipped away in the night. No details on how, no explanation of why, just a vague implication that pointed back to Caleb. The sheriff's office called again, their tone heavy with unspoken accusations. As Caleb set the phone down, he felt the storm in his world intensifying, a tempest of suspicion and betrayal that threatened to tear apart everything he held dear. Caleb sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow that seemed to strip away any warmth from the air. His hands, rough from years of labor, rested calmly in his lap, fingers interlaced as if anchoring himself against the relentless tide of questions. The detective's voice was sharp, repetitive, each query slicing into the quiet resolve Caleb clung to. I found a boy alone in the woods, Caleb said, his tone steady but carrying the weight of exhaustion. He was cold, scared, probably hadn't eaten in days. I took him to the only place I had, a warm barn, a safe corner. I gave him food, a blanket, a chance to feel human again. That's all I did. His words were simple, but beneath them ran a current of defiance, a quiet insistence that he'd done no wrong. The detective leaned forward, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing. Then why'd he run, Caleb? If you helped him, why'd he bolt? Caleb's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to the scratched metal table. Maybe because strangers dragged him out of the only safe place he'd known in who knows how long. Maybe he's been through hell, and trust isn't something he can afford. The silence that followed was heavy, louder than any accusation, as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for someone to break. Back at the farm, the world felt like it was closing in. The house, once a sanctuary, stood dark and lifeless, the electricity cut off like a severed lifeline. Caleb and his son, Noah, had packed what little they could salvage. Clothes, a few keepsakes, the weight of memories they couldn't bear to leave behind. They'd retreated to the barn where the air was sharp with the bite of winter. The livestock's warmth was their only comfort, the soft snorts and rustles of the animals mingling with the creak of old wood. Caleb and Noah curled up on a pile of wool blankets, their breath visible in the frigid air, curling like ghosts in the dim light. Noah, his small frame tucked against his father's side, whispered, "Dad, why are they so mad at you for helping that boy?" The question hung there, innocent yet piercing, and Caleb felt it lodge in his chest like a splinter. He stared up at the barn's rafters, the rough-hewn beams stretching into the shadows, as if they might hold answers he couldn't find. After a long pause, he spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes, son, doing what's right makes people uneasy. It holds a mirror up to their own choices, and they don't always like what they see." Noah didn't respond, but his small hand tightened around Caleb's arm, and soon the rhythm of his breathing softened into sleep. Caleb lay awake, the quiet dignity of his actions wrapping around him like the blankets, a shield against the world's judgment. Just before dawn, a sound snapped Caleb awake, footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching across the frost-covered grass outside the barn. His heart kicked into overdrive, a primal instinct urging him to protect his son. He sat up, the cold air stinging his lungs, and reached for his boots, his movements silent but swift. The steps paused, then faded, as if the visitor had reconsidered their approach. Caleb crept to the barn door, easing it open just enough to peer into the gray morning. No one was there. The world was still, save for the faint mist rising from the ground. But then he saw it, an envelope resting gently against a hay bale placed with care, as if it carried something sacred. No markings, no address, just a single folded piece of paper inside. Caleb's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing 6 words in sharp, deliberate script. "Thank you for saving my nephew's life." Below, a single line. "We cannot come forward yet. Help is coming." No signature, no name, just those words, stark and heavy with meaning. Caleb stood frozen in the early morning light, the note clutched in his hand. His mind churned, questions piling up like storm clouds. Was this a cruel trick? Some twisted game from a town that had already turned its back on him? Or was it real, a fragile thread of gratitude from someone out there in the shadows? He read the words again, then a third time, each pass etching them deeper into his mind. The handwriting was meticulous, each letter formed with purpose, as if the writer had poured their soul into every stroke. Something about it stirred him, a flicker of belief he couldn't fully explain. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his worn jacket, the weight of it grounding him even as his world felt like it was unraveling. The morning brought no answers, only the cold reality of their situation. Caleb and Noah loaded the last of their belongings into the old pickup truck. A few bags of clothes, Noah's school books, the battered coffee pot that had seen better days, and a box of photo albums wrapped in a faded blanket, each item a piece of a life they were being forced to leave behind. The house stood empty, its windows dark, the land no longer theirs, claimed by legal papers and silent agreements. Across the street, curtains twitched and faces peered out, their gazes no longer sharp with judgment, but softened, hesitant, perhaps tinged with shame. Caleb didn't want their pity. He didn't need their whispered regrets. All he needed was a place for Noah to lay his head, a corner of the world where his son could feel safe. As the sky lightened, Caleb pulled Noah close, the boy's hair soft against his lips as he kissed the top of his head. "It's time to go, son," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet ache. The barn door closed behind them, and Caleb cast one last look at the land, his grandfather's fields. The apple tree his wife Evelyn had planted with such care, the porch where Noah had wobbled through his first steps. He'd already said his goodbyes, silent and heavy, to the life they'd built here. The truck was loaded, the engine rumbling softly, ready to carry them to an uncertain future. But as they prepared to leave, something stirred in Caleb's chest, a whisper of hope, faint but stubborn, urging him not to give up. The note in his pocket felt like a promise, fragile but real, and for now it was enough to keep him moving forward. The morning air bit at Caleb Morgan's skin as he stood in the quiet of his barnyard, the frost still clinging to the grass beneath his boots. He hadn't slept much, not with the weight of the past few weeks pressing on his chest like a stone. The rumors swirling through town, Ephraim, Sham, whispers of his involvement and with something dark, something dangerous, had cost him nearly everything. His neighbors avoided his gaze, his friends had grown distant, and the life he'd built here felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't stay, not anymore. But just as he turned to head back inside, a sound stopped him cold. It started as a faint rumble, far off, like the hum of a storm brewing on the horizon. His heart quickened. That wasn't a tractor's familiar groan or the soft purr of a neighbor's car. This was heavier, primal, a chorus of engines roaring in unison, tearing through the early stillness like a blade. Caleb stepped out into the yard, his breath clouding in the chilly air as the first rays of sunlight broke over the hills. Then he saw them, 6 military jeeps, their forest green camouflage glinting dully in the dawn, barreled down the access road toward his farm. Dust and frost swirled in their wake, tires chewing into the gravel with a relentless grind. They didn't slow as they passed through the open gate, fanning out with precision to encircle the barnyard in a tight semicircle. The vehicles formed a wall of steel, their engines idling with a low, menacing growl. Caleb's pulse hammered in his throat. He stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. What was this? An arrest? A raid? The rumors had painted him as a criminal, a traitor. But this felt like something else entirely. Around him, the neighborhood stirred. Curtains twitched as curious eyes peered out from behind them. A few braver souls stepped onto their porches, clutching coffee mugs or pulling coats tighter against the cold. Their faces were a mix of confusion and fear, mirroring the storm brewing in Caleb's own chest. Was this the end of the whispers or the beginning of something far worse? No one spoke. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the creak of a Jeep door swinging open. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wasn't dressed in standard military fatigues, but his movements carried the weight of authority, each step deliberate, commanding. His jacket bore no name tag, no insignia, yet his presence filled the space like a physical force. He walked toward Caleb alone, unarmed, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Stopping just a few feet away, he met Caleb's gaze with eyes that were steady, unyielding, but not cruel. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice calm yet resolute, "we're here to protect you." Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had even heard the words. Protect me? The phrase echoed in his mind, sharp and surreal. His life had unraveled because of the boy he'd taken in, the boy who'd shown up, half frozen, silent, and terrified. Caleb had done what he thought was right, but it had cost him his reputation, his peace, his place in the world. And now this man was telling him they were here to protect him. His jaw tightened, a mix of disbelief and bitterness churning in his gut. Before he could respond, another door opened, this time from the second Jeep. A small figure climbed down, his movements hesitant but deliberate. Caleb's breath caught. It was him, Benji, the boy who'd appeared on his doorstep weeks ago, barefoot and shivering, wrapped in a tattered coat, his wide eyes haunted by something Caleb couldn't name. Now Benji stood wrapped in a clean, oversized coat, his gaze scanning the horizon as if searching for something, or someone. Caleb staggered forward, his heart lurching with a flood of relief so intense it nearly knocked him to his knees. "What is this?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of too many emotions. Fear, hope, confusion. The commander tilted his head toward the barn, his expression unreadable. "It's time you knew the truth," he said simply. And in that moment, everything shifted. Caleb's breath hung in the air, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what was unfolding before him. The world he'd known, the life he'd clung to, felt like it was dissolving into something new, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Another man stepped forward from the second Jeep, taller than the commander, dressed in civilian clothes but with the sharp, alert posture of someone trained to see everything. His eyes swept the perimeter, taking in every detail. The neighbors watching, the frost on the ground, the faint creak of a porch swing in the distance, before settling on Caleb. He kept one hand resting lightly on Benji's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and grounding. "My name is Colton Reeves," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm Benji's father." Caleb's brow furrowed, his mind struggling to process the words. "You're his father?" he repeated, the question heavy with disbelief. Reeves nodded, his jaw tightening as if the words carried a burden he'd been carrying for too long. "I'm also a federal agent," he continued, "deep undercover. For the past 3 years, I've been embedded in an international arms trafficking ring. My cover was blown 3 weeks ago during a raid. We were forced to abandon our safe house." His voice faltered just for a moment, and Caleb saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. "In the chaos, we got separated. I thought my son was lost. Or worse." Caleb's gaze drifted to Benji, who stood quietly beside his father. For the first time, the boy's small hand reached up, clutching the edge of Reeves' coat. The gesture was so simple, yet it spoke volumes: trust, fear, a desperate need for connection. Caleb's chest tightened. He remembered the night Benji had appeared, half dead from the cold, unable to speak, his eyes wide with terror. Caleb had taken him in, fed him, warmed him, all while the town turned against him, branding him a criminal for sheltering a stranger. "I didn't know," Caleb murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He wouldn't speak. He was freezing. "You didn't need to know," the commander, Hayes as he'd later introduce himself, said, stepping up beside Reeves. His tone was firm but not unkind. "You did more than most would have. You saved his life." There was a weight to his words, an acknowledgement of the sacrifice Caleb had made, but it did little to ease the ache in Caleb's heart. He shook his head slowly, his eyes distant. "And I lost everything doing it," he said, the words raw, laced with the bitterness of a man who'd paid too high a price for doing the right thing. Hayes's expression softened, a rare crack in his otherwise stoic demeanor. "We've been monitoring you," he admitted, "not just for Benji's safety, but for yours. The men we're after are dangerous. If they discovered who had sheltered him, you'd have been a target." Caleb's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring in his chest. "So you let me take the fall?" he asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Reeves stepped forward, his hand still on Benji's shoulder. "We couldn't break cover until the operation was secure," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "But that's over now, and I'm here to make things right." From one of the jeeps, an officer approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. In his hands was a sealed envelope, thick with documents. Caleb caught a glimpse of federal seals, military authorizations, and legal papers as the officer handed it to Hayes. The commander held it out to Caleb, his gaze steady. "This is the beginning," Hayes said. "The truth, the protection, the answers you deserve." Caleb stared at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. The weight of it felt heavier than paper, heavier than anything he'd ever held. It was the weight of a new chapter, one he hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. As he stood there, surrounded by jeeps and soldiers, with Benji's wide eyes watching him and the neighbors whispering from their porches, Caleb felt the ground shift beneath him. The life he'd known was gone, but something else was taking its place. Something bigger, something he couldn't yet name. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something like hope, fragile but undeniable, burning quietly in the cold morning air. The news from Commander Hayes landed like a lifeline, pulling Caleb back from the edge of despair. All foreclosure proceedings against his farm were stopped, frozen in their tracks. A confidential letter accompanied the order, its promise of substantial compensation, a quiet reassurance after years of struggle. His land, once a battleground against debt and doubt, was now a temporary federal safe zone, a designation that felt both surreal and sacred. Caleb stood motionless, his rough hands trembling as the weight of the words settled into his bones. He turned to Benji, the boy whose haunted eyes had pierced his heart, and for the first time their gazes met with something deeper than fear, a spark of trust, delicate but growing, like the first green shoot after a long winter. The truth had finally broken through, raw and unyielding, but the future stretched ahead, vast and uncharted, ready to rewrite their lives in ways Caleb could hardly fathom. By noon, the barnyard, once a haven of quiet toil, pulsed with new energy. Military personnel moved with disciplined precision, setting up perimeter defenses and converting the farmhouse kitchen into a makeshift command center, its counters now cluttered with communication gear. Outside, the gravel road was lined with satellite vans from 3 national news networks. their polished exteriors gleaming under the midday sun like onlookers at a historic event. A press briefing was being prepared, its message carefully sculpted, reviewed, and approved by those at the highest echelons of authority. Caleb stood apart, still wearing his faded flannel shirt and boots worn thin by years of labor. His hands bore the scars of hard work, his face the lines of a life spent under the open sky. But today, the world no longer saw a farmer fighting a losing battle. They saw a man who had staked everything to protect a child, his courage a beacon in a storm. The recognition settled over him, not as a crown, but as a quiet affirmation of a choice made from the heart. That afternoon, every major news station in the country aired the security footage from Caleb's farm. The grainy black and white images told a story more powerful than words. Caleb carrying Benji through the raging storm, his broad shoulders a shield against the wind, wrapping the boy in blankets by the fire, his hands steady yet tender, feeding him soup, his gaze never wavering from the child's pale face. The footage looped endlessly, and with it, the tide of public perception turned. Neighbors who had once shunned Caleb, crossing the street to avoid his gaze, now left letters at his gate, their words heavy with remorse. Flowers bloomed in makeshift bouquets, their petals bright against the weathered fence. The school principal, her voice soft and eyes downcast, stopped by to ask if Noah would return to class, her apology a quiet admission of misjudgment. Caleb said little, not out of bitterness, but because he knew silence could speak louder than triumph. In a world that judged swiftly and questioned slowly, his selfless act had ignited a spark of reflection. He hadn't sought the spotlight or craved acclaim. He'd simply refused to turn away from a child in need. Now, a nation that had once dismissed him was beginning to see him anew, its respect returning not with fanfare, but with the quiet power of truth. The following morning, as dawn painted the sky in soft golds, Caleb sat alone on the farmhouse steps, a tin mug of coffee warming his hands. Steam rose in delicate spirals, blending with the cool morning air. The barn, once a last bastion against ruin, now stood strong behind reinforced fencing, a testament to survival. Soldiers moved quietly across the property, their presence unobtrusive yet reassuring. From inside the house came the sound of small footsteps. Benji appeared on the porch, clutching the stuffed bear Noah had given him, its worn fur a comfort in his small hands. He paused, his eyes tracing the horizon, then walked over and sat beside Caleb without a word. The silence between them was warm, woven with mutual understanding. Moments passed, and then, so softly it nearly slipped away, Benji spoke. "Is the farmer safe?" His voice was rough, uncertain, but it carried a rare gift, concern for another, born from the warmth of a fire, the comfort of soup, and Caleb's steady presence through the worst night of his life. Caleb turned, his breath catching at the sound of the boy's first sentence. It took him a long moment to respond, his voice thick with emotion. "I am now," he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise kept. Inside the barn, Noah was already at his morning chores, humming a gentle tune as he brushed one of the horses. Benji soon joined him, the two boys working side by side as if they'd known each other forever. Their laughter floated through the air, a melody of hope. That evening, Agent Reeves returned, his face lined with both weariness and gratitude. "He spoke today," Caleb said, his voice still soft with wonder. Reeves nodded, his eyes glistening. "You made him feel safe," he said. "That's something I couldn't do. Not until now." They stood together, watching as Noah and Benji chased fireflies through the twilight, their laughter a fragile but radiant thread in the gathering dark. The wind carried the soft chime of distant bells, a gentle reminder of the world beyond the Morgan farm. As Caleb stood in the fading light, his heart heavy with gratitude. "I'll never be able to repay you," Agent Reeves had said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes reflecting a debt he felt could never be settled. Caleb, weathered by years of toil and solitude, shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything," he replied, his voice steady but warm. "Some things, a child's first laugh, the peace of a quiet barn, they're worth more than any payment. They're what we leave behind." His words hung in the air, not as a dismissal, but as a truth carved from a life of hard-earned wisdom. In the weeks that followed, the Morgan farm began to stir back to life, like a field waking under the first spring rain. The military presence, Once a constant hum of tension faded to a whisper, now just the occasional patrol or the crackle of a radio check-in. But their time on the farm had left more than memories of protection. The soldiers had mended the sagging fences, their hands steady as they drove new posts into the earth. The irrigation system, long choked with neglect, now flowed smoothly, breathing life back into the thirsty soil. The old tractor, which Caleb had given up on years ago, roared to life again, its engine purring thanks to the ingenuity of the unit's mechanics, who'd worked on it in stolen moments between their duties. These were gifts, not just of labor, but of hope, a reminder that even broken things could be made whole again. Yet the truest transformation wasn't in the land or the machines, it was in the people. The townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid Caleb's gaze, their whispers trailing behind them like shadows, now came to his doorstep with offerings of casseroles, fence posts, and quiet apologies. Some couldn't find words to bridge the years of distance. Instead, they brought steaming mugs of coffee and stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the fields, mending what they'd once let fall apart. Their silence was heavy with regret, but also with a desire to make things right. One crisp morning, the school principal appeared, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers, her eyes brimming with tears. "We failed you, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her admission. "But if Noah's ready, we'd be honored to have him back at school." Her words were a lifeline, a chance for Caleb's son to reclaim a piece of childhood that had been stolen by fear and misunderstanding. Even Frank Delroy, the neighbor who'd once turned his back, pulled up one day in his weathered pickup, his two sons perched in the bed, their faces curious and open. Frank stepped out, handed Caleb a pair of pliers, and said simply, "You need help with that gate." There were no grand gestures, no long-winded explanations, just the quiet resolve of a man trying to right a wrong. Caleb accepted the pliers, and together they worked, the clink of metal and the rhythm of their labor stitching something new between them. One Sunday morning, as the sun painted the sky in hues of gold, a small wooden sign appeared at the edge of the farm's driveway. Its message was simple, etched in careful letters, where one father chose courage over fear. No one stepped forward to claim it, and Caleb didn't ask. He let it stand, a quiet testament to a choice that had changed everything. Through it all, Caleb remained unchanged by the attention that followed. Neither the flicker of cameras nor the murmurs of praise could shift the core of who he was. He still rose before dawn, the world still dark and quiet as he packed Noah's lunch with care. He still walked the fields, his boots tracing paths worn by generations of Morgans before him. But now, when people looked up at the farmhouse on the hill, they no longer saw a recluse shrouded in rumors. They saw a man who embodied something rare and true, a quiet strength that reminded them of what doing right could mean. Spring arrived early that year, painting the fields with the vibrant green of new wheat, a promise Caleb had once feared would never come. The barn, once a cold and silent shell, now rang with the laughter of two boys, Noah and Benji, chasing each other through the hayloft, their voices weaving joy into the air. A life that had once teetered on the edge of loss had taken root again, stronger than before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Agent Reeves stopped by, as he often did now that the danger had passed. He found Caleb kneeling beside a sprouting rose, its delicate petals a symbol of something fragile yet enduring. "The operation ends next month," Reeves said, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "I've requested reassignment, something permanent, something stable." Caleb nodded, his heart catching at the thought of change. "Benji and I will miss you," he said quietly. Reeves hesitated, his hands fidgeting as if searching for the right words. "Actually, I was hoping Benji could stay here, at least part-time," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "He's different with you, Caleb. Calmer. He laughs more. This place, it's healing him. It's healing us both." Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned his gaze to the house where Noah and Benji stood by the creek, tossing stones and watching them skip across the water's surface, their laughter rising like music. A small smile tugged at Caleb's lips. "We've got room," he said simply, and in those words was a promise of family, of belonging, of a future built on trust. That night, as fireflies began to flicker in the growing dusk, Caleb sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The barn lantern cast soft, golden circles across the weathered boards, and for the first time in years, peace settled deep in his chest. The farm hadn't just been saved, it had been transformed. It was no longer just a place of survival, but a home, alive with the warmth of those who shared it. This wasn't because of the fences or the tractor, but because of who they had all become. People bound not by obligation, but by choices made in courage and kindness. In a world where headlines flash by and judgments come even faster, Caleb's story lingers like a quiet truth. Doing what's right doesn't always feel safe. It often comes with a cost. But Caleb didn't act for recognition or reward. He didn't wait for approval. He saw a child in danger, Benji, scared and alone, and he moved, his heart leading where others might have hesitated. His choice cost him dearly at first, stripping away the trust of his community, leaving him isolated. But in time, it gave him more than he could have imagined. Not wealth or fame, but the respect of those who'd once turned away, a family stitched together by shared healing, and a legacy that Noah and Benji would carry into the future. It was a harvest not of crops, but of connection, proving that kindness, though often overlooked, is never wasted.